One of the things that I have learned in my years as a pastor is, and as a Christian for that matter, is that not everything that everyone says about you is accurate. And like that goes both ways. One of the things that I tell the students in my class at Summit, they're going to hear this on day one here in a few weeks, because I'm adjuncting at Summit again this semester. One of the things that I tell our students at Summit is, or my students at Summit is, you're not as bad as your worst critic says you are. And this is important. This is an important one right here. You're also not as great as your biggest fan tells you that you are. Not everything that everyone says to you is accurate, is true, and that's good or bad. When we hear feedback, like we want to be discerning in that. We want to kind of think it through. We want to, especially if it's negative, we're going to look for maybe there's a nugget of truth in that. That's something that we practice here at WestWay Christian Church, is when someone gives us negative feedback, before we rush to judgment on that feedback, we try to wrestle through with, okay, like, is this true? What about this is true? And even if it's something, I want to be careful the way I talk about this, because I don't want to discourage anyone from giving feedback. Even if it's something that's completely what I would consider to be irrational or unreasonable or unrealistic, there might be some truth in it. So I want to consider that, right? Like, what might be true about this feedback that this person is giving me? But also remembering that not everything that everyone says to us is accurate. And that's I think it's a healthy way to think about things. Because from a negative standpoint, if I listened to and gave equal credence to every single thing that people said to me that was negative, I would have the worst self-esteem in the entire world, which would lead me to people pleasing, which is where we're getting to in the text that we're going to talk about here in a second. So if I am consistently responding and reacting to negative criticism, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to be tempted, and I most likely will overcompensate by then trying to do things that are going to make people happy. So if I flip that around and say, let's say that I believe my biggest fan, it's probably one. Let's say I believe my biggest fans, and that's all I believe. And the only feedback I allow into my head is the positive things that people tell me. Well, then what that's going to do is that's going to give me a big head. And because of my propensity to please people, I am going to then look for ways to give them more of what they want, right? In Galatians 1:10, Paul says this: obviously, I'm not trying to win the approval of people, but of God. If pleasing people were my goal, I would not be Christ's servant. See, Paul has this perspective on life, and it's particularly about the gospel. The context of Galatians is Paul has shared the gospel with the people of Galatia. Many of them, at least the believers, have obviously received that gospel. They've accepted that gospel. They've become Christians. They're being transformed into the image of Christ. And then another group of people, I don't know why I had trouble stumbling over my words on this on Sunday, but a number of evangelists then came into the churches of Galatia, and they started sharing another gospel. And the gospel that they were sharing was the people had to do something. They had to add to the work that Jesus had done on the cross. And what Paul is saying is, and this is going to come out like as we read through the letter, we're going to talk a little bit more about this in a few weeks. We want to read the whole letter. Essentially, the gospel is our proclamation of the gospel, and our reception of the gospel is not about us pleasing people, but about pleasing God. So what that means is we don't water down the gospel so it is more tolerable or more palatable to people. We don't water down the gospel. We don't minimize aspects of the gospel just so people will give us the response that we want. That's what it looks like to please people. And what Paul is going to say later in the book of Galatians is that's what these false teachers, that's what these evangelists are doing. They're proclaiming a message that waters down the gospel in a way that makes it more tolerable for their recipients. Makes it not easier to understand, but how about this? How about easier to obey? It feeds something in them, and this is what we talked about in week 2, I think, of this Galatians series, is we're all people who we like to do things. We like to do things because we receive affirmation and approval from those things. When we do things and we do them well, like we get to tell people get to tell us that, right? So we want to do them well again. And this isn't like don't do good things. I'm just trying to help us wrestle with, there are times where we desire the approval from people in unhealthy ways. We desire the affirmation from people in unhealthy ways. And what Paul is warning against, he's warning the Galatians against, is, look, we want to please God. At the end of the day, I am more interested in what God thinks about the way that I fulfill my role as lead pastor at WestWay Christian Church. I am way more interested in what God thinks about the way I fulfill my role than I am about you. I'm more interested in the way that God knows what I've done than I am about what our church body knows I've done. And this gets into the whole preferences thing that we talked about in Convictions and Essentials a couple days ago. I know that there are some people whose preferences we have a 20-minute sermon. And I know there are some people whose preferences that we have an hour-long sermon. And frankly, I don't cater to either of those preferences. My job isn't to, and my role as a pastor isn't to cater to the desires and the whims of people. My desire is to cater to what God has for me to do. And I was talking to another pastor about this a few months ago, and he just basically, he kind of put me at ease in this. He said, God, this is just how God has wired me to be. God has wired me to teach and preach and lead in the way that I do. And that doesn't mean that I don't want to be open and humble and learn new things. It doesn't mean any of that. But what it does mean is I can only be who God has called me to be. And you can only be who God has called you to be. So what I would challenge you in that, and that's not like a license to just do whatever the heck you want. Again, we're going to be talking more about this in Galatians over the next several months. But what this is we are to live our lives in accordance with what God has for us, and to please God and to seek to please God in all of the things that we do. And that pleasing God is the priority in our lives. I'm not trying to win the approval of people, but of God. If pleasing people were my goal, I would not be Christ's servant. If all I thought about on a given Sunday morning is I have to give a 20-minute sermon because these people are going to be mad at me if I don't. Like, I wouldn't be true to what God is calling me to do. But it would also be true if I said, if I don't preach an hour-long sermon, these people are going to be mad. Like, we can get caught up in all of these things. And what we just really need to be aware of here is that God has called us to do certain things. God has called us to proclaim the truthfulness of the gospel. And he's not embarrassed of the gospel. He's not ashamed of the gospel. Paul writes, I think it's in, I should know this. I think it's in 1 Corinthians that he's not ashamed. He's not ashamed of the gospel. I should have looked this up beforehand. Let's see here. Maybe it's Romans 1. Oh, this is the worst. This is why no one watches these videos. And for the one person who is, thanks for sticking out. This is Romans 1. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel of this good news about Christ. It's the power of God at work, saving everyone who believes, the Jew first and also the Gentile. So we, as Christians, we are not ashamed of the gospel because our job is to please God and not men. Think about that, reflect on that, think about some areas in your life where you are tempted to seek approval from other people in an unhealthy way. And give that over to God and seek the approval from God. Love you, praying with you, praying for you. Talk again soon.